Good afternoon. This is Ashley Golden, and I'm the Assistant City Manager with the City of Oxnard. I will be presenting the budget preview for fiscal year 24-25. First, I'll provide a brief summary of municipal budgeting, then cover where we are forced to go due to a number of factors. I'll then provide highlights on our progress of the Council's 5-year priorities. And finally, I'll present preliminary recommendations that we will be making to City Council for next year's budget. So first, let's talk about where our revenues come from for the city. People often say, we pay taxes, but where does our money go? So let's talk for a few slides about the city's major revenue sources. First, the most common tax people think of is income tax. I want to be clear, state and federal income taxes do not come to the city. For example, on a $40,000 salary, you'd keep about $36,000 of that and pay over 7.5% to the federal government and just over 2% to the state government. No income tax comes to the city of Oxnard. So if no income tax comes to the city of Oxnard, what taxes do come to the city? We get about 31% of our revenues from property tax each year. On the slide before you is an example of property tax which residents that own property within the city would pay. The largest portion of that tax goes to the schools, followed by the county. As you see on the slide, the city receives just about 17% of that property tax. So when you see that property tax bill, know that it's not all coming directly to the city. For example, a resident pays $5,000 property tax bill. The city would only be receiving about $880 of that payment. Next, sales tax. A large portion of our revenue comes from sales tax. That is about 50% of our revenue source in the general fund. As of April 1st, 2021, the sales tax in Oxnard became 9.25%. Now, again, the state gets the largest share of the sales tax at just under 4%. Just over 3% of that 9.25% comes to the city. The 3% is made up of Measure E, 1% base tax, which is frequently called Bradley Burns, which was the name that was given when it was implemented, Measure O, and a very small portion of Prop 172 public safety tax. Measure O, which is part of the 3% I mentioned, sunsets or ends in 2029. At that time, our sales tax will be 8.75%. Measure O ending equates to a loss of about $20 million in today's dollars in revenue every single year. So items that are exempt from sales tax, there are a few, like groceries and prescription drugs and utilities, plants or seeds, things like that. So when you buy a $20 shirt, you'd pay $1.85 in sales tax. The city would get about 60 cents of that $1.85. On the screen before you is a graphic that we've been using for a few years. And I know there's a lot shown on this graphic, but I think that it's a great representation of where the city has come. We refer to this as the man in the hole. So I want to remind folks starting on the far left-hand side of the page or the screen that not very long ago, literally 4 years ago, we were facing a $9.2 million structural deficit. The city council had to make very difficult decisions, including laying off over 30 employees. We've worked through those difficult years, including withstanding a global pandemic. And thankfully, the voters had enough confidence to vote for and give us Measure E, the sales tax, which helps us climb our way out of this hole. With the approval of the council's 5-year priorities in fiscal year 21-22, council began to restore services and programs such as restoring maintenance of our parkways and our medians and our trees, making street and alley improvements, as well as restoring youth and senior programs, investing in cybersecurity, investing in the community development department staffing to help with permit process, just to highlight a few. In that same year, the Oxnard Amazon Fulfillment Center opened, which brought a positive impact to the general fund revenues and more than 1,500 great jobs with benefits to our community. Now, it's not all rosy, and external factors such as the supply chain disruptions, labor shortages, and inflation affect how quickly we can restore services, complete projects, and in some cases, even start projects. But the biggest single factor slowing us down is a 2020 bond litigation from Mr. Starr, which completely halted our ability to issue municipal bonds. Municipal bonds are a primary tool government agencies use to fund large infrastructure projects such as paving our roads and building city facilities like senior centers. But despite all these external factors, we've been making adjustments, maintaining stability, and planning for the future. And this year's budget is still positive, albeit cloudy, with a steady incline to walk up, probably some loose ground underfoot. But for a fourth year in a row, we are not facing any budget or service cuts of any kind. Again, it's simply a question of what we can afford to restore and invest in for this upcoming year. Plus, we have to continue to plan for the sunsetting of Measure O. Again, that's at least a $20 million revenue source to the city annually that will end in March of 2029. So next, we'll be moving into external and social impacts. So despite being stable and proposing a balanced budget for 24-25, the road ahead is not sunny. It's cloudy. Like I said, we'll be walking uphill. We're likely to encounter a rock slide or two, but we will be prepared and we will continue to adjust. For the next few slides, I'll talk about some external and social impacts affecting our revenues and the proposed budget. First, inflation. This chart from the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics shows the changes of the Consumer Price Index, known as CPI, over the past 14 years. As you can see on the right-hand side of the chart, in 2022, the increased cost of everyday items like food, utilities, apparel, and the like rose to 9.1%. While the CPI has lowered to 3.5% today, it is still high. And just like the businesses and community members, we as the city have to budget for all those increased costs. This slide is from the Harvard Joint Center for Housing Studies and shows that home prices have soared relative to income in a growing number of metro areas. Out of the 100 largest markets in the country, Ventura County was one of 7 markets with a price to income ratio above 8. This shows the increasing housing affordability challenges both locally and nationwide. While higher home prices impact our property tax revenues favorably, the city also has to deal with the impacts of the state housing crisis and homelessness that this creates. Moving on to economic uncertainty. As it relates to local governments, you'll see a variety, many headlines on the screen before you. These are examples of recent headlines showing California cities that are facing budget deficits and discussing ways to address the budget shortfalls, from cutting public safety spending and cutting jobs to placing sales tax measures on the ballot. While Oxnard has faced these realities in the past, it's not where we are today. Today, we are fairly stable after years of that financial instability. And again, with the voters' approval on Measure E and the opening of the Amazon Fulfillment Center, luckily, these headlines are not what we're seeing here locally. Next, sales tax revenues. Sales tax growth for much of California is expected to be flat for the fourth quarter of 2023 and most of 2024. Although Oxnard has not experienced this due to new laws working their way through the state legislature, this current year, we are likely to see changes to our revenue, actually decreases to our revenues in upcoming years. There are many state legislature items being discussed that would affect the taxes for distribution centers like the Amazon Fulfillment Center. Again, this could have a very negative impact on our overall sales tax. Moving on to the Aaron Starr bonding litigation. We talked about this a bit in last year's budget, and it continues to have impacts for our recommendations in the 24-25 budget. Under normal circumstances, we would use cash for everyday operations such as public safety, seniors and recreation services, but you would bond for major multi-generational projects. That's exactly what we had planned to do for our computer program known as the ERP, basically the brain system behind all of the computing that we do here at the city, as well as major infrastructure needs related to our streets. Now, the Star litigation holds up the needed financing, which was approved for $45 million in bonds. Again, that would have replaced our 30-year-old computer system and repairs for roadways. But we can't just let the streets, our largest asset, deteriorate further. So we have recommended cash funding in the last budget as well as in the upcoming budget, and a little bit in 2022, at least for the ERP. So if we would have bond funded these projects, the 45 million that I spoke of earlier, that would have cost us approximately $3 million a year in that annual bond payment. Instead, as you can see on the screen before you, we are cash funding, meaning year over year, we are putting in cash to the tune of, in fiscal year 23-24, roughly 17.5 million. And in the current budget, we're recommending over 17 million dollars. Again, this would have only been $3 million if we would have been able to bond finance these projects. That's a lot of money that we could have spent on other much needed services in the community. Senior programming, recreation programming, whatever that need is, that extra money could have been used for that. But not only does it affect our ability to bond fund these needed projects, it also affects our ability to bond fund many of the other projects the city had planned for, including renovating senior centers and building a new senior center, building the South Oxnard Aquatic Center, replacing 5 fire stations, repairing seawalls, proceeding with sports park, and that's just to name a few of them. So streets are measured by a term called Pavement Condition Index, or PCI, which ranges from 0 to 100, with 0 representing a failed road and 100 being a brand new road. Our current PCI is 67, up from 66 last year. If not for the Mr. Star bond litigation, we would recommend budgeting an average of 23.3 million annually for street and alley projects to reach a 70 PCI in 10 years. But we would only recommend spending that amount if we could secure bonds. If not, we are investing in streets at the expense of many other important community needs and services. But that is the reality that we face. And because we are forced to fund these projects in cash, in fiscal year 24-25, we are recommending budgeting 20.8 million across various funds, which will only maintain our current PCI of 67 rather than increasing it to the council's policy of 70. On the screen, you'll see an example of debt issued in the past 5 years by comparable California cities and populations around 200,000. This is just another example of how common a practice it is for municipalities to use bonds for large-scale infrastructure improvements and capital projects. Again, this is a tool that Oxnard does not have access to due to the Mr. Star litigation. Now, this slide shows just Ventura County public agencies. It's not specific to cities. And it shows that the Ventura County public agencies had issued or refinanced over $4 billion of debt between 2019 and 2023. Now, this slide does include 110 million of bonds that Oxnard was able to secure before the bond litigation. But again, Oxnard is deprived of this important financing tool that many communities use to finance large-scale infrastructure projects. The council priorities, which are based on community input, called for many restorations and improvements that relied on bonds. Moving on to the labor market. Last year, we shared how many cities, including Oxnard, were struggling with labor shortages. And while that still exists, it is to a lesser degree. Instead, we are seeing a competitive market, meaning we're receiving qualified applicants and a decline in our overall vacancy rates, but the applicants are able to be more choosy. They're being enticed with various incentives, and we can't always compete with that. To achieve Public Safety Council priorities over the last few years, we focused on recruitments, but in police specifically, we continue to see a tough hiring market. This year, we implemented 2 pilot programs to help with the recruitment. The first is a lateral hiring incentive, meaning an existing peace officer moving from one agency to another would receive a financial incentive of $20,000, which would be paid over time after they hit specific milestones. And other agencies, this hiring incentive has been as high as $75,000. The second pilot incentive program is a recruitment incentive where existing Oxnard police staff would receive a $3,000 incentive payout when a recruited person successfully completes their probationary period. As of March 31st, we have seen the sworn officer vacancy rate increase to 8.5%. And as of the recording of this presentation, it has increased to 9.35%. However, the overall city vacancy rate has decreased. As I stated earlier, we're seeing more qualified applicants, but we continue to see a competitive market. Next, the unreliable supply chain. Pre-COVID, it took about 8 months to deliver police vehicles. Today, the order for 15 police department vehicles has been delayed by more than 3 years. For fire vehicles, pre-COVID, when we ordered fire vehicles, it usually took 18 months to receive them. Now we are being told 4 years to receive a fire engine and 4.5 years to receive a ladder truck. Political uncertainty, well, everybody has different views, but regardless, we do know it's uncertain. There's political uncertainty in the US and around the world. We have the US presidential election in November 2024, and as all the headlines suggest, our country is very polarized. No matter who wins, there will be divisions. Impacts throughout the globe can be felt here locally. As we saw with the pandemic, supply chain disruptions have caused multi-year delays in delivery. Today, there are more than 30 wars being fought throughout the world, and they have the potential to impact everything from the price of gas to computer chips that power all of our daily technologies. Moving on to our council priorities. Shown on the screen are the 5 overarching priorities, and the main categories are quality of life, economic development, public safety, infrastructure and natural resources, and organizational effectiveness. I'll touch on a few of these priorities, but the next few slides are dense with information that you can read, or you can take a look in the proposed digital online budget book for additional information. So first, quality of life. This included restoring and enhancing our youth programs. Prior to Measure E, the city's recreation staff served nearly 98,000 young people through their recreation centers and programming. As part of our restoration efforts, in this fiscal year, the recreation staff is projected to serve nearly 138 youth. That's an increase of 40.8%. Major recreational program investments included the reopening of Durley Youth Center, extending Colonia basketball open gym hours to serve an additional 250 youth a week, and the kickoff of the Arts Academy, reaching at least 84 youth so far. Another quality of life priority is to restore and enhance our senior programs. Since the reopening of the Colonia Senior Center in 2021, Oxnard has served over 150 additional seniors. In 2022, Colonia Senior Center hours were extended 2 hours daily, increasing programmable time by over 500 hours annually, which is a 60% increase. Regarding homelessness, as we know, this is a crisis, but we continue to increase supportive services and expect a new 110-bed shelter and 56 permanent supportive housing units to open in 2025 right here in downtown Oxnard. Now, the bonding litigation has slowed progress for the new senior center and South Oxnard Aquatic Center, which are also priorities within quality of life, because we cannot access the funds to construct these facilities. For the economic development category, we're in the design stages for the improvements to 4th Street corridor, which is the corridor that connects the train station to downtown. This project includes curb extension, crosswalks, bike lanes, bike racks, and lighting to help improve the pedestrian experience. We're also continuing our partnership with Oxnard College and the Chamber for the Oxnard Employee Pipeline, where we connect our community members with the skills and training they need to get hired by the great companies that are headquartered right here in Oxnard. We've also made progress in retaining and expanding businesses. We're seeing a steady increase in the number of permits. We committed $1 million towards a wayfinding program to promote tourism areas within the city, and 4 new hotels are already under construction or nearing construction. For the public safety priority, as many of us know, public safety is paramount in every community, and I will just briefly touch on it now. But if anyone is interested in diving deeper, the fire chief presented an annual update to the city council in March 2027. And in March of 2024. And as I said earlier, the online digital budget will include much more information on the council priorities. So regarding the restoring and increasing paramedic squad priority, since 2028, the city has doubled the number of firefighter paramedics on staff, and we've been able to place a second paramedic squad at Station 6, which led to a reduction in response time to 4 minutes and 40 seconds. Regarding maintaining 911 emergency response times within this priority, Oxnard Emergency Communication Center answers 911 calls 24 hours a day, 365 days a year. Call volumes for the police department have increased 2% and 5.6% for the fire over the previous year. This priority continues to be impacted by vacancy rates in the competitive labor market. For the maintaining fire protection services priority, although the fire department is understaffed compared to other California city averages, it continues to catch up on staffing and focus on fire prevention efforts, including installing more than 7,500 smoke alarms over a 2.5-year period. Almost there. Stick with me. I know this is long. 2 more priorities to work through here. So next is infrastructure and natural resources. This priority overall has by far had the biggest impact related to the external and social impacts discussed earlier, such as Mr. Starr's bonding litigation, the competitive labor market, unreliable supply chains, and inflation. The city's council's priorities including restoring proper street paving and repairing alleys. Since 2021, with the voters' approval of Measure E, the city has invested $54.7 million to restore Oxnard streets and alleys after many, many years of deferred maintenance. Bringing our PCI, remember that's the grade on our streets, to a 67, up from a 64. Another aspect of the infrastructure and natural resources priority that we have made significant progress in is related to proper maintenance of parkways, medians, and tree trimming. With Measure E, we were able to increase our mowing schedules from attempting them only monthly to now doing them weekly or every 2 weeks, depending on the type of surface. For tree pruning, previously, we were pruning less than 2,000 trees, and now we are pruning more than 7,000 trees annually. And finally, organizational effectiveness. We have made significant progress within all 5 priorities of the organizational effectiveness priority. As referenced when I talked about the man in the hole, Oxnard has faced significant budget challenges in recent years, but we are making slow and steady progress that is securing Oxnard's long-term financial stability, including increasing revenues, which has allowed us to replenish the city reserves from a low of 2.2% in fiscal year 2021 to 13% in the current budget, and a recommendation to increase to the best practice reserves to 16.6 in the proposed budget. Now, I know that was a mouthful there, but we in the year of fiscal year 2021 only had $3.4 million in our reserves. That was 2.2%. And we will be recommending in this upcoming 24-25 budget to have 16.6%. That's close to $37 million. In addition to that, in just a 12-month period from the years of 2022 to 2023, the city's issuer credit rating went from an A to an A+, which marked Oxnard's 5th upgrade by Standard & Poor's. Improving our credit rating is very important because it lowers the cost of finance infrastructure for the community. Similar to you or a community member's personal credit rating, you simply get better rates for loans when you improve your credit. One of the largest investment areas that we've had and progress that we've experienced within organizational effectiveness is within the information technology department related to cybersecurity. In the last 3 years of restoration budgets, and investments in the information technology department total nearly $9 million. And that's excluding the investment in the city's 30-year-old computer system, the ERP that I referred to earlier. Although there are many more staffing needs, we've been measured in those restorations. It's a delicate balance with the labor market challenges to add new positions when there are difficulties in filling many positions. In addition, we've launched staff training and development programs. Now, last year, I spent quite a bit of time talking about these key financial principles, and so I will highlight our progress within these 7 areas. These things aren't very visible to residents, but they are so important for our ability to continue to provide services to our community. And we must adhere to these 7 key financial principles so we can continue to improve our bond rating and achieve the council priorities. So first up on the left-hand side of the screen, maintain fund balance. As a best practice, the Government Financial Officers Association recommends that cities maintain a fund balance of at least 2 months of the general fund's expenditures to cover the city's finances in the event of an emergency. The reserves, also known as a rainy day fund, can be used to fund everyday general services such as fire, police, recreation, and the like. As I mentioned earlier, during Oxnard's challenging budget years, back when the man was really at the bottom of the hole, we were operating with 2.2% reserves. The council's current reserve policy is 14% for fiscal year 24-25, with an overall policy of 16.6%. However, in this year's budget, we are recommending that the council reserve policy be met this current fiscal year, meaning that we jump from 13% reserves that we are in the 23-24 budget all the way to 16.6 in this 24-25 proposed budget. Next, debt capacity. Our debt capacity has improved because the city is unable to issue new debt due to Mr. Starr's bonding litigation. In addition, governmental resource revenues have grown. However, the city continues to be cautious on the impacts of future cash flows and the ability to make payments over the long term, as revenue trends are uncertain. The third item, budget flexibility. As you'll see in a few slides, we will have the highest fund balance in more than a decade, if not longer, and improvements are being made in the sense that our revenues are growing faster than our fixed burden. For financial performance, the goal is to hit your targets. Using our newly acquired budget software allows us to better monitor and analyze data. And as shown in the fiscal year 23 annual comprehensive financial report, variances to budget in the general fund were only 3.8% for operating expenses, which is well below the 10% target. Stable management. In the management category, looking at the stability of the management is key. And as many of you know, our city manager, as well as many of our department directors, have been here for over 5 years. Also, making a difference in our community is a measurement of this principle. City management has focused on meeting the goals of the City Council 5-year priorities, which include promoting and restoring the quality of life, maintaining public safety, and have made significant investments in our infrastructure. And also, this financial principle looks to being proactive. And as we've talked about in last year's budget, and again in this year's budget, we are planning for the Measure O sunsetting. Moving to cybersecurity, the 6 of 7 that I'll go over here. As mentioned earlier, we have invested heavily over the last 3 years of restoration budgets in cybersecurity and continue to do so, with recommending an increase of nearly $5.4 million in fiscal year 24-25. These are behind the scenes investment, but they are vital to city services. And lastly, on these financial principles is financial reporting. Financial reporting includes producing clean opinions from external auditors 4 consecutive years with an audited unmodified opinion, and for a second year in a row, our financial corrective action plan has resulted in no new findings and no repeat findings. Now, I know that's a lot of information on here, and again, it's behind the scenes, but these financial principles, along with increasing our credit rating, are important in order to lower our financial risk, lower the cost of finance infrastructure, increase our capacity to debt finance infrastructure, give council access to funds to deliver services to our residents, create more financial flexibility over time, and allow us to weather a downturn in the economy. And very important, at least to us as staff, it's also very important to create credibility with residents regarding the city's ability to manage taxpayer monies. And now, what many of you have probably been waiting for, what are the recommendations for the 2024-2025 budget? Despite over $20 million in general fund and Measure O department needs for the upcoming fiscal year, due to many of the social and external impacts I covered, including inflation, a limited revenue growth, the impacts of Mr. Starr's bonding lawsuit, and the Measure O weaning schedule, which I will speak more to in a bit, We are only recommending just under $11 million in requests so that we can maintain a balanced budget. So some examples of what we are not recommending for restorations include additional dollars for youth and senior programs such as swim and gym classes, additional fire department personnel, training needs across departments, a street milling machine for needed street repairs and remodels to various fire stations. So where are we recommending investments in 24-25? This is an overview of the proposed general fund investments by departments. You'll notice a theme in the text on the screen related to inflation and increased utility cost, as well as recommendations related to vehicles. Vehicles is an area where we did not invest for many years during our deficit years. For some context, the general fund electricity costs have grown from nearly 2.2 million in fiscal year 21 to nearly 3 million in the proposed budget. That's a 38% increase. And utilities, including water, fuel, telephones, electric, gas, are budgeted at a total of 5.6 million, which is an increase of 1.1 million since just last year. So within the police department, staff recommends an increase of 1.1 million. That's inclusive of an overtime structural adjustment to reflect approved labor rates, patrol vehicle leases, the Ventura County Animal Shelter increased cost, and body worn cameras, as well as already mentioned utility adjustments due to inflation. In addition, the police will see a reduction of 4 vacant sworn positions and will instead use that associated funding to fund contracts to provide internet crimes against children investigator services by the DA, a radio communications infrastructure subscriber plan with the County of Ventura, as well as ongoing costs to maintain service dispatcher consoles. And although we are in great need of additional sworn officers, as you saw earlier in the slides, there is quite a high vacancy rate. So until that vacancy rate is a little more under control, using this funding to still provide services by the county and others will help meet the needs of our community. For the fire department, we're proposing an increase of 2.7 million. This includes overtime increases for mandated station coverage, which is 1.9 million of the 2.7 million recommendation. It's also funding related to vehicle leases and a transfer of 3 grant-funded firefighter positions to the general fund. For public works, we're recommending an increase of 1.5 million to pay for the utility and inflation adjustments that I've talked about, and also including much needed machinery, including a bucket truck and park vehicle leases. But the majority of this money really is related to inflation. There's also approximately 3 million in the proposed budget and ongoing expenses related to already approved employee pay and benefit increases. For cultural and community services, we're proposing an additional 500,000 in funding to provide adequate funding for the temporary labor rate. Our previous budgets were calculated prior to the $15.50 minimum wage being enacted, which really was impacting cultural and community services ability to use temp labor. So we are right sizing that within this proposed budget. It also includes enhancements for library security services and training and development for library staff, and includes additional funding to accommodate increased costs associated with the junior high graduation event. Internal services is a proposed increase of 4.3 million. That is for primarily information technology department, which is where we provide software and cybersecurity and infrastructure needs for the cities overall. Some projects that will be underway in the information technology department include rent control software, bidding software for public works, and staffing management software for public safety. We're recommending 500,000 in the city manager's office for a Native American artifact study related to the Carnegie Art Museum collection. Overall general fund positions, we're recommending various reclassifications and 10 new general fund positions that results in a net increase of nearly $900,000. And also within the general fund, we're recommending, 500 of the 1.5 million that you see on the screen is required to maintain funding for the workers' comp fund at a consistent confidence levels in line with city policy. But because there is a budget surplus, which I'll touch on in a few slides, staff recommends an additional $1 million payment be put towards the workers' compensation unfunded liabilities, which total approximately $20 million. Related to the CIP, which is an area we may see some changes because the CIP will be heard before the council on May 21st. So this information is subject to change before we go to city council in June on the general fund budget. But as of the recording of this presentation, we're recommending funding for Ormond Beach restoration efforts, roof replacements, and the ERP system, as well as street resurfacing. As I have mentioned numerous times, if not for Mr. Starr's bonding litigation, we would not be recommending $10.5 million in general fund spending on streets and the ERP. We would have bonded for these and only had a payment of approximately $3 million overall, which would have included additional street work than what we're able to fund. Here's an overview of the proposed new Measure O projects. The city's proposing new one-time operating projects totaling $900,000. This is inclusive of the November election for additional ballot measures, plan checking consulting services within the fire department due to hard to fill positions, equipment for public works, including a 10-ton dump truck and the purchase of a backhoe, as well as funding for rent stabilization program support. The 24-25 Measure O proposed budget also includes $14 million of recommended capital improvement projects. As I mentioned earlier, the capital improvement projects program is going to the city council on May 21st. So these recommendations are subject to change due to the outcome of that meeting. But at this time, we are recommending funding for recreation facilities, including the Colonia Pool, the Colonia Boxing Gym, and South Oxnard Library, as well as $5 million for neighborhood street resurfacing, $4 million for citywide alleys, $2.5 million for Mandalay seawalls, and $1 million for traffic signal modifications, and $1 million for public restroom improvements. As I've said many times throughout this presentation, the streets projects would have been funded with the bond that we had approved in 2022, if not for Mr. Starr's bond litigation. Now, here's a slide you've probably not seen in at least a decade. We are happy to report that we have a budget surplus of $35 million. A budget surplus is the term used to describe the amount remaining after accounting for the proposed budget expenses, including the general fund reserve policy. Many people are probably thinking, wait, earlier in the presentation, you know, that man in the hole, didn't you say you had a $9.2 million structural deficit just 5 years ago? How do you go from that to a $35 million surplus? Well, a couple ways. First, council took immediate action and made severe budget cuts to get our expenses and revenues in alignment. Second, voters passed Measure E, increasing our annual revenues by approximately $59 million. Also, there has been a large influx of state and federal monies, which have helped slow down our general fund spending on some specific projects. But probably more than anything, the tax distribution for online retailers, such as the Amazon Fulfillment Center, is a huge contributor to this surplus. Because Amazon is located in Oxnard, the city receives a larger share of revenue based on the current laws. But also, as I mentioned earlier, there's state legislation working its way through the system now that could drastically change that. So we are looking at this money as one-time money, not ongoing revenue, and therefore we do not recommend new ongoing cost. Instead, we are recommending a $20 million payment to buy down a significant position of the city's long-term debt. In addition to that, we're recommending increasing the reserve policy from 14 for the upcoming fiscal year to 16.6. That would bring us to a total of $37.3 million in the rainy day fund or reserves. Finally, we are recommending holding on to $5.5 million for the mid-year budget review, after which time we should have a better understanding of the economic health of our area. One of the most important things to discuss when approaching every budget is that we are looking out many years ahead and being fiscally responsible. What I mean is we are planning the current budget with the 2029 budget in mind. For those of you who follow City Hall, you probably already know that that is when Measure O sunsets. And as I mentioned earlier, that's about a $20 million annual drop in today's dollars in the city's general fund budget. We need to consider that now rather than come up to 2028 and face a financial cliff, which is essentially what this will be. But by planning now, we are hoping and we are planning that it will not be such a devastating cliff. The Measure O committee recommended and the council approved a weaning schedule in 2022. The Measure O weaning schedule ensures we are slowly and methodically moving Measure O funded ongoing programs to an alternative source such as the general fund. However, external factors continue to impact the weaning schedule. And although we say a smooth transition, this is no longer smooth. It's very bumpy, and we continue to recommend large expenses out of Measure O for the streets and ERP system due to the Aaron Star bonding litigation. This is an example of programs we have moved from Measure O to general fund, meaning this is an example of our weaning. In fiscal year 24-25, as previously approved by council, staff is weaning nearly $1.1 million from Measure O to the general fund. Of this, we are weaning just about $1 million. Of this $1 million, that includes the enhanced computer aided dispatch, also known as the 911 system, records management and mobile data computer system, and the remaining 100,000 reflects the integrated library system and library Wi-Fi projects. So Measure O revenue projections are around 21.6 million, which is just over a $200,000 increase from the current fiscal year that we're in. And we're recommending expenditures at 22.9 million, which is a decrease of 1.3 million from the current fiscal year. As I've already mentioned, the projects at the top are those that we are weaning, meaning moving from Measure O into the general fund. And the projects, the 8 projects listed at the bottom, I covered on a previous slide, slide 30. This proposal includes use of $1 million in fund balance, leaving a projected surplus of 14.7 million at the end of fiscal year 24-25 within Measure O, which will allow for us to continue weaning until the sunsetting of Measure O, as well as paying off debt associated with Measure O. We're coming up upon the end here. Thank you for sticking with me. We are getting into some charts and graphs here that will really talk about our revenues and expenses. So what's on the screen before you is the general fund revenues. On the left-hand side, we're proposing a $235.7 million revenue budget compared to expenses of 255.7. And I'll talk about that $20 million difference there because we are proposing a balanced budget. This is approximately a 5% increase in our revenues and expenses from the current fiscal year, with 6.5 million of that revenue growth related to interest income due to highest interest rates and other reimbursements, which we do not expect to be the trend in upcoming years. Again, we look at that, some of that increase as one-time growth. So this slide includes many figures that I've mentioned earlier within the presentation related to sales tax and property tax. As I mentioned, property taxes are about 1/3 of our revenues, and sales tax, in this case, the Bradley Burns and Measure E combined, are just around 50%. Other revenue sources include business license and transit occupancy tax charged to hotel guests, as well as other non-tax revenues. Again, in total, the general fund revenues are proposed to be 235.7 million. On the right-hand side of this slide are recommendations on how to allocate the general fund by department. We are proposing 255.7 million in expenditures, which is more than the revenue we are expecting, but that ties back to the $35 million in general fund surplus that I touched on a few slides ago. And that increase, or that difference between the 255 in expenditures and the 235 in revenues, is the $20 million payment that we are proposing to pay off or pay down the long-term pensions and liabilities. So we would have a balanced budget with this proposal due to the surplus. Again, that is representing the $20 million payment towards long-term debt using the surplus funds. Often we get questions on this about how large public safety, meaning police department and fire department, are out of the overall expenses, meaning percentage wise. But as I went over previously, and also as I touched upon last year in the presentation, these departments are significantly understaffed as compared to other agencies our size. Also on the screen, you'll notice the other large expenditures are within the Public Works Department. And I'll just note again, this is where we're proposing to fund over $7 million in street projects due to the bonding litigation. Slide 36 represents the proposed 24-25 budget expenditures by expense or expenditure classification, meaning major groupings of expenses. So like most cities, especially full service cities, the general fund's largest expenditure is for labor to provide the essential public safety, recreation, project management, engineering, and other services that are required in a complex city with multi-services and full cities. Salaries and benefits represent nearly 2/3 of the city's budget. The next largest expense category is transfers out. This covers transfers to the CIP that I mentioned earlier. Also includes transfers to internal services funds, which provide our information technology and cybersecurity, facility maintenance, liability insurance, and fleet services. Transfers out also includes the city's financing authority for external bond payments and transfers to stormwater, special districts, and traffic safety. The services category includes professional services, primarily within the Public Works Department. It also includes the animal shelter funding, legal services, and audit services. The financing category includes the final loan payment from the general fund to Measure O, as well as the cost of vehicle leases in the service center. Supplies includes equipment, training, and uniforms. Utilities and energy includes electricity, gas, vehicle fuel, water, sewer, and trash. And as mentioned earlier in the budget, this is a significant area that we've seen costs grow due to inflation. Here we have our estimated preliminary revenues and proposed expenditures for all funds. This snapshot shows an all funds revenue totaling $719.2 million and proposed expenditures totaling $760.5 million. The financials here are also discussed in more detail by the Finance Department's budget presentation that accompanies this budget agenda item. The general fund expenditures are $20 million higher than the budgeted revenues due to the pay down of long-term debt. Otherwise, these two lines would be in balance. Enterprise funds is combined $17.6 million higher, as they are using fund balance for capital projects, vehicles, and machinery. This is inclusive of water, environmental resources, and wastewater in the Gulf. Measure O, as discussed earlier, Measure O expenditures exceed revenues by $1 million as part of the long-term plan to utilize a mixture of fund balance and new tax revenue to pay for projects. Measure O has a surplus fund balance that will be required to service debt obligations that continue beyond the sunset date of March 31st, 2029. Public safety retirement, this is also known as the Carmen override, enables the city to fund $17.9 million in public safety retirement costs for tax increments to city businesses and residents that would otherwise be charged to the general fund. Eligible expenses are $18.9 million, reflecting the cost of the pensions. The other $1 million is funded from the brought forward fund balance. An internal service fund is a fund that provides benefits primarily in the form of goods or services to other funds, departments, or agencies on a cost reimbursement basis with the goal to break even, not to make a profit. The city utilizes internal service funds, also known as ISFs, to provide for liability insurance, workers' compensation insurance, information technology and telecommunications, facilities maintenance, janitorial services, fleet services, fuels, and utility billing. The ISF have higher expenses than revenues because they will be consuming a portion of its fund balance built up over a number of years, which is similar to what I discussed with the enterprise funds. For example, the IT department or information technology department has had a high number of vacancies over the last couple of years, which limited the department's ability to complete all projects, thereby leaving a surplus fund balance to which IT can now use within the proposed operating 24-25 budget and beyond without having to charge the departments again. The other funds category on the far right includes expenses of $152.8 million. This is inclusive of special districts, assessment districts, state gas and RMRA taxes, federal and state grants, which is a major component of that one, specifically $119.4 million for the Rice and Fifth Overpass, homeless services and CDBG grants, stormwater, and other smaller funds. Overall, before you is a balanced budget, which represents a 5% growth in both our expenses and revenues specific to the general fund. We're really close. I congratulate you if you are still with me here. I'm about ready to wrap this up. I'd like to go back to a reminder of an earlier slide. I know that was many minutes ago. But again, I think it's very, tells a good story of where we are and where we're going. So the clouds represent the many uncertainties we still face. Generally speaking, we're seeing a tightening economy where California as a whole is seeing a flattening and in some cases declining sales tax across a number of categories, which equates to less revenue for Oxnard. You may or may have not seen the headlines, but local governments throughout California are experiencing budget shortfalls, which I discussed earlier. We're also seeing changes among traditional retailers, with many national chains closing brick and mortar locations. Oxnard has benefited as an outlier given our recent passing of Measure E, recent addition to our tax base of the Amazon Fulfillment Center and Distribution Center. But there are challenges, and some of these are challenges that all cities are facing, like the impacts of inflation and political uncertainty in the competitive labor market and supply chain issues, as well as the November 2024 ballot measure currently called the Taxpayer Protection Act, which our council opposed back in April of 2023. But other challenges are more unique to Oxnard, such as the laws making its way through the state legislature that could affect a large portion of our sales tax allocation in Oxnard, and Mr. Starr's bonding litigation that other cities are not challenged with. But despite these clouds and the uphill walk, we're recommending a 5% increase in both our expenses and revenues related to necessary items like inflation, utility increases, state mandates, and increases across departments aligned with fulfilling council's priorities. We would like to recommend additional restorations. As I mentioned earlier, departments submitted over $20 million in requests. But Starr's bonding litigation requires the city to continue to spend cash on streets if we want to maintain our PCI. But to end on a positive note, this year's budget is still positive, and for a fourth year in a row, we are not facing any budget or service cuts of any kind. We have a balanced general fund budget and are able to recommend a $20 million payment towards unfunded liabilities. And another first for the city, and some would say just as exciting as a $20 million payment towards unfunded liabilities, but I don't think many of you. We will have our first online digital budget. Yes, we have made it to the 21st century, over 20 years late, but we have arrived. We warned you last year that it was the year of the tortoise, and that seems to be continuing. So the city began using the new OpenGov digital budget program for fiscal year 24-25. It's still under construction as we continue to complete this website, and we will continue to work out the formatting issues, including tables, charts, page numbers, page breaks, fonts, and the like. Our goal is to provide an easy to use format for community members, but we know this will take time with it being our first year. So that finishes this presentation. There are the traditional ways to stay involved, like attending the council committee and council meetings. But from a practical standpoint, if you're not able to do that, I recommend that you read the city manager's budget message. And from there, you may be intrigued to take a deeper dive into the information that'll be available on the website. The upcoming meetings includes the city's Finance and Governance Committee on May 14th, followed by a public hearing at the City Council on June 4th. And with the various amounts of input at both of those previous meetings, ultimately we plan to come to the City Council on June 18th for a recommendation to adopt the budget. So with that, I thank you very, very much for making it through to the end of this presentation. And I look forward to you being involved for the further steps. Thank you.